Real people are scarier than monsters. We live in a townhouse, so all the houses are adjacent to each other. Unfortunately, the unit to the right side of our house has already been bought. During the day, there are loud hammering and drilling sounds, which is perfectly understandable, since they were fixing and installing fixtures and rearranging things. But at night, the sounds are quite disturbing. My bed is against the wooden wall adjacent to our neighbor's house. There were nights when I heard scratching on the wall. It's just weird that the sound comes from different parts of the wall. But last night was the all-time creepy. My parents went out with their friends at night, so I was left alone in the house. I'd just finished binging movies when I decided to go to bed. I was half asleep when I heard scratching on the wall. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting louder. Then I heard the scratching sound from the other end, then at the middle of the wall, then at the ceiling. It really was getting scary. For a moment, it stopped. Then I heard noises on the ceiling. It's as if something or someone is crawling or walking. I hurriedly opened the flashlight app on my phone and pointed towards the ceiling. I was scared to the bone when I saw people looking at me, peeking from a hole on the ceiling. Basing from their expressions, they were surprised as I am, then they gave a creepy smile. I ran out my room shouting and locked myself up in the bathroom. I was catching my breath as I called my parents from my phone. They didn't believe me at first, but when they heard a police siren in the background, they immediately hung up and went home. During the investigation, it was found out the people I saw on the ceiling were not our new neighbors, but the contractors they hired. Our new neighbors haven't moved in yet, because they hired people to install and mount additional fixtures in the unit. I developed a trauma after that incident. I'm having difficulty sleeping because my anxiety continues to grow. I keep thinking that someone will drop on the floor from the ceiling any moment. So I started sleeping under my bed. At least, I know what's under it. The summer heat was oppressive. But the nights were worse. Our neighborhood was usually quiet, but there was something unsettling about that way. Mr. Roberts, our elderly neighbor, kept to himself. He lived alone in the house next door, which always seemed to be in perpetual darkness. One evening, as I sat in my room playing video games with the window open to catch a breeze, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside. Curiosity getting the better of me, I peeked outside the window. In the dim glow of the street lamp, I saw Mr. Roberts crouched by the side of his house, his back turned towards me. He started digging the ground with something, like a shovel. The rhythmic scraping noise made my skin crawl. I was transfixed watching him as he dug a small hole in the earth. It wasn't the action itself that frightened me, but the eerie calmness while he was digging, as if in a trance. Just as I was about to look away, Mr. Roberts stopped abruptly. Slowly, he turned his head towards my direction, as though sensing my gaze. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly ducked back inside, pulling the curtains shut. I sat there in the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart. Minutes passed, but the scratching sound did not resume. Eventually, I summoned the courage to peek outside again. To my relief, Mr. Roberts was no longer there. But as I scanned the empty yard next door, something caught my eye, a freshly dug mound of earth barely visible in the shadows. Fear gripped me as I realized what it could mean. What was he burying out there in the dead of night? Thoughts raced through my mind. Did someone go missing? Was it an animal? Or something else entirely? I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me that night. From then on, whenever I walked past Mr. Roberts' house, I couldn't help but glance nervously at that patch of disturbed earth, wondering what secrets lay buried beneath. Summer vacation had just started, and I was excited to spend my days biking around the neighborhood with my friends. Our street was quiet, except for the occasional car passing by or the distant hum of lawnmowers. But there was one house that always gave me the creeps. The old Victorian house where Mrs. Thompson lives. Mrs. Thompson lives in seclusion, rarely seen outside except to collect her mail or tend to her overgrown garden. She had a stern face and piercing blue eyes, that seemed to follow you as you walked past her house. One afternoon, my friends and I were riding our bikes near Mrs. Thompson's property. We heard a voice calling out from behind the tall hedge that bordered her yard. "Hey, kids, come here for a second!" The voice called, raspy and insistent. Curiosity getting the better of us, we approached cautiously. Peering through the dense foliage, we saw Mrs. Thompson standing there, her face partially obscured by the shadows cast by the towering hedges. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound brave despite the unease tightening in my chest. Mrs. Thompson's lips curled into a crooked smile, sending a chill down my spine. "I've got something to show you," she said with her pitchy and gravelly voice. I exchanged nervous glances with my friends, unsure of what to do. But before we could respond, Mrs. Thompson beckoned us closer, stepping back into the shadows. Against my better judgment, I followed, my friends trailing reluctantly behind me. The air grew cooler as we ventured deeper into the hedge maze that surrounded Mrs. Thompson's yard. Suddenly, Mrs. Thompson stopped in front of a small weathered shed tucked away in a corner of her yard. "Come inside," Mrs. Thompson urged, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the way she looked at us, as though we were prey caught in a trap, sent a wave of terror through me. But before I could protest, one of my friends stepped forward. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something glinting in the corner. A pile of old photographs scattered haphazardly on a dusty table. My stomach dropped as I recognized faces. Familiar faces from our neighborhood, including my own. "What are these?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Mrs. Thompson stepped closer, her grin widening. "Just some memories," she replied cryptically. Without another word, we stumbled out of the shed, scrambling through the maze of hedges and back onto the street. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of my friend's house. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. From that day on, I avoided Mrs. Thompson's house at all costs. Haunted by the chilling realization that behind her quiet facade, lurked something far more sinister. A darkness that threatened to swallow us, whole.